All right, welcome everyone to the 2024 Hathitrust member meeting. I am Melissa Stewart, the member relations specialist for Hathitrust. And before we kick things off, I'm going to go through a little bit of housekeeping. So if I can figure out how to advance my slide here. Oops, here we go. Back. All right. All right, so as you can see, we are in Zoom webinar format for today's meeting. So audio and video are muted for all participants. Only panelists can be shown on screen and use their microphone. So please use the chat for reporting technical issues or if you want to do any discussion between attendees. And then you can use the Q&A for questions for panelists. Jessica Rohr is with us today and will be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat. Closed captioning has been enabled, so you should be able to, I'm not sure how, depending on your browser, you should have a CC symbol, either probably in the lower right of your screen that you can use to turn on those transcriptions and enjoy all the fun ways that Hathitrust is misspelled by Zoom transcript. And finally, the meeting is being recorded, and we will be posting this meeting afterward on our YouTube channel, and I will be sharing a link with all attendees and all registrants, hopefully by early next week. And with that, also our code of conduct. We do have a code of conduct, even though this is a virtual meeting. Please be kind to each other in the chat and the Q&A to our panelists and all of our attendees. And please email us if you feel in any way you were mistreated in the course of this meeting. And now I am going to turn it over to Beth Namachevaya, the University Librarian at University of Waterloo and the chair of the Hathitrust Board of Governors.
Thanks, Melissa. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many of you able to join the member meeting this year. Our annual meeting is a great opportunity to get feedback from you, the members, and to talk about what Hathitrust is, has been developing, and what they plan to develop. This year, Hathitrust introduced a new strategic plan that responds to the changed circumstances of our member libraries, the world, and Hathitrust itself, but builds on our existing strengths. The plan refocuses on the collection, and our meeting theme reflects this. To create a shared understanding of this critical foundation of Hathitrust and its services, this year's meeting centers around committed to the core, stewarding our shared collection. The agenda for today is here on the screen. Mike Furlough, who spearheaded Hathitrust's strategic visioning effort, will speak with us about Hathitrust's near and long-term plans to operationalize our strategic vision. I'm especially delighted to share the news that the Hathitrust board recently approved the renewal of Mike's appointment as executive director of Hathitrust for a 5-year term. We'll then welcome Katherine Skinner, research lead at Invest in Open Infrastructure, to deliver this year's keynote address. Katherine's address will be followed by a break. Then we'll turn to a series of panels on centering the collection and its value, moderated by Hathitrust Associate Director Jennifer Vinipal, and featuring several Hathitrust staff and staff from Hathitrust member libraries. There will be time for your questions throughout the agenda. There are many individuals and groups who bring Hathitrust services and operations to fruition through their leadership. First, I'd like to introduce the current Board of Governors. There are some changes coming to this roster. I wanted to take a moment to announce that at the start of this month, Gohar Ashugyan resigned from the Board of Governors because she has taken on a new role as Dean of Libraries at Simon Fraser University. Congratulations, Gohar, and thank you for your service to the board. Teresa Bird and Shumao Wang are both concluding their terms as both elected board members this December. Finally, Claire Stewart, who has served as our board chair and co-chair of the Strategic Visioning Committee, is concluding her term as an appointed representative of the BTAA. That's the Big Ten Academic Alliance. I want to thank Gohar, Teresa, Shumao, and Claire for all of their work in service to Hathitrust. Now, let me announce the new members of the board. The membership of Hathitrust has elected both Maria Estorino, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Carmelita Pickett, University of Virginia, to 3-year terms on the Board of Governors. The board has appointed Lori McAllister from Hofstra University to a 1-year term to fill the vacancy left by Gohar's resignation. Later this year, BTAA will appoint a new member of the board to replace Claire. We'll share the news of that appointment when it's complete. We look forward to working with the board over the next few years. Now I'd like to take the opportunity to recognize and thank the members of the Program Steering Committee. The PSC meets regularly to advise the board and Hathitrust leadership on strategic and programmatic agendas for Hathitrust. Earlier this summer, the Board of Governors appointed Rice Majors as the new chair of the Program Steering Committee for 2 years. Rice is at the University of California, Davis. Finally, I want to also recognize the entire Hathitrust staff, which has been growing substantially over the last year. There are 4 brand new members of the Hathitrust team, and 2 of the staff have assumed new roles after national searches. Those names in bold have joined Hathitrust within the past year. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike. Thank you.
Whoops, it's time for me to speak. Thank you, Beth. Thanks so much. And let me say thanks to all of you for being here again at the Hathitrust member meeting. This is 2024. It's edition number 11, I think, of these meetings. I just want to acknowledge, since the news of my continuing with Hathitrust, how fortunate I am to be able to lead this organization, especially working with such fabulous colleagues as those who are right now checking to make sure every piece of technology on this webcast is working. I'm just enormously grateful for your trust in this organization and our work. Hathitrust is a community resource. It's one that we have created together to meet the needs of members and their users to support researchers broadly. And what I know from my time working here at Hathitrust is that you all rely on it heavily and you want to be able to rely on it more. And so I want us to be able to meet those expectations. I will take a few moments here to share my reflections on some work that we've had underway this year, and I'll also spend more time talking about work that we have coming forward, coming out of our strategic planning process. I want to talk a little bit about all of that and contextualize the work we're doing. So on the next slide, I just have a few highlights of work that we are doing for someone's mic is on. Just want to note that. We have some work that we have been completing this past year here at Hathitrust. It's been a very busy year. You've seen news of some of these things, and some of these things have been a little bit more behind the scenes. So recently we created an accessibility, or not created, we completed an accessibility assessment of our website and did a number of updates. We have been participating in Project Lend, which I'll talk about in a second. We have been working to develop and expand our incident response and security protocols for reasons you can imagine. We have been working to, as Beth noted, hire more staff who are focused on a number of business functions that are intended to help us really build more resilience in the organization. So these include roles to support project and process management, assessment, member relations, financial management, collection strategy. It's really quite a bit of investment in new functions to help us as an organization meet the needs of a growing membership. And then we also have had internally among the staff, and beginning to speak with PSC, some focus on equity and social justice. There's a staff group that meets periodically to focus not just on a discussion of these issues, but really to focus on action activities that we can undertake or projects we can do that will have a real impact, or so we hope, around equity and social justice. Some of the things that we have underway or have had underway recently is a close look at harmful content in the collection and developing a statement that acknowledges that, and reviewing what we do when we receive complaints or concerns about issues in the collection. We are also going to be returning to our code of conduct work, which we had to pause for a while. And we expect in the coming year, we'll be having some internal discussions about land acknowledgements and how we might approach the set of issues that are arranged around that. Always, when these issues become ripe or they reach a certain level and we're ready to engage, we will always bring these to our membership, to our governance bodies to talk them through. We've talked through harmful content with the program steering committee recently, and we will continue to do that probably with full membership sometime next year. So on the next slide, I just want to refer back to the meeting theme here. It's committed to the core, stewarding our shared collections. And the core here that we're referring to is the collection of digitized materials that's been entrusted to us. That's the central resource for everything that we do. Included in your package is a flyer, a little fact sheet about about the collection, some high-level details about the collection, where it comes from, what it contains. But really, this term, this focus on committing to the collection and centering the collection, stewarding the shared collection, comes out of our strategic directions. And on the next slide, I have a few highlights from our strategic visioning work this past year. What I want to say to you is that needs and expectations evolve over a long period of time, 15 years in our case. They can also change rapidly, as we've seen coming out of the pandemic in recent years. So our entire planning process in 2023 and 2024 was really focused on how we need to change and what we need to focus on to meet these evolving, changing expectations in our community and beyond. I want to also acknowledge a truth that we often don't acknowledge in public. Strategic plan statements are relentlessly positive and proactive, but often lack specifics, right? So I will try to fill in some details of work we'll do that we hope will realize some of the goals and vision from the strategic plan. So the strategic vision acknowledges that we have room for improvement, right? If everything were perfect, we wouldn't need a strategic vision. We'd continue doing our work. But we know that users and members want a more diverse, useful, and accessible collection. They want continuous platform updates, quicker addition of materials, expanded availability. And what I believe the strategic vision does most importantly for us is it gives us a framework to really focus our energy on the collection and gives us a framework for decision making, both about what to do and also what not to do, right? So as we evaluate current work or proposed work, we're going to be focusing on opportunities and decisions that really truly strengthen the collection and meet our commitments, and we'll have to let go of those things that we believe don't. So I'm going to spend the remainder of my time talking about our efforts to increase access and use and to enrich text and metadata. The other two, four of the four strategic directions focused on expanding and diversifying the collection and investing in enabling infrastructure. I think themes related to those issues will surface throughout the keynote address and the discussion later today. So I'm going to leave those aside. So on this next slide, what I have for you is the objectives that we outlined under the direction to increase access and use. Right, our plan is that our intention is to expand access to and increase use of the copyrighted, open, and public domain works in the Hathitrust collection. And what I would like to point to start with is that the emphasis here is on the need to understand users to inform all of our work. Right, that's right there up front. And we've been participating in a project over the last couple of years that has really helped us substantially with that. On the next slide, I'll share some details here about Project Lend. Project Lend is a program that began at the University of California, Davis 2 years ago with funding from the Mellon Foundation. The goal of the project has been to conduct user research and legal research to examine needs and options to expand access to ebooks. So based on what users do and what they say they need, and how they describe what they do, the question is, how should the digital book environment function? What can we do to meet those needs? Also based on statute and case law, what are the pathways we have for implementation of new forms of access? There is a webcast coming up, I believe on November 1st, where Rice Majors and others from the team will be sharing the results of this work. So I don't want to share any further about that. They'll do that then. I believe we have registration details to drop into chat shortly, but I just want to promote that for you. And I just want to say also that the work that we've been engaged in with this project, and especially the user research, has been enormously enriching and beneficial. In some ways, it tells us what we know. but it also has helped us at Hathitrust think about users in a different way, recognize the reality of their needs again, and also think about where we do or don't and how we should be fitting into the overall ebook ecosystem. So that's going to be informing our work going forward over the next several years. Now, expanding access to the material in the collection is something we've focused on since the start of Hathitrust and since the start of mass digitization, right? Our goal really is to enable reading and machine access to the fullest extent we can, given the constraints of copyright. But we also know that since mass digitization began about 20, 25 years ago, there have been major players in various content industries that have tried to limit book digitization and restrict how libraries and users can use digitized content. In this campaign, they've sued Google, they've sued Hathitrust, they sued libraries such as Georgia State, and more recently, they sued the Internet Archive. And so I want to talk a little bit about the outcome of the Hachette case and what I think it means for expansion of access. I also want to just right off the bat here say how appalled I am at the kind of denial of service attacks that have happened for the Internet Archive, and I've been watching closely and hoping for them to be able to resolve that quickly, and I want to send my thoughts out to them on that point. But in regard, it's not really been a great year for them, right? Because they also lost their appeal in this case with Hachette. And what we know about this case is that it emerged in the wake of the pandemic as libraries were closed, and we were all trying to figure out ways we could provide access to collections. Publishers sued Internet Archive on the basis of their program of controlled digital lending. The recent rulings have really clarified how courts view controlled digital lending, and it's fair to say they take a very dim view of it, to say the least, right? They do not see it as fair use. Now, all fair use cases depend on specific facts, and this ruling technically only applies to the facts of the Internet Archive's instantiation of CDL. But court cases offer clues on how similar cases might be decided in the future, right? It gives guidance to other members of the judiciary, and it gives guidance to us all. So in this case, the heavy focus on market availability, the potential impact of controlled lending on ebook sales, and the really high bar that defendants have for meeting the burden of proof to prove the negative, right? That they have not actually harmed ebook sales is really problematic. It's concerning. It's very upsetting. It is not impossible, but I do think this case makes it much harder for us to look at ways to develop large-scale controlled digital lending programs in the United States. It's not impossible, but implementing them has become more challenging, requires even more care and even more thoughtfulness. So when we created the Emergency Temporary Access Service back in 2020, we rushed, but we tried to be as diligent as we could in creating that service. And I want to tell you today that despite the Hachette ruling, we still believe that the Emergency Temporary Access Service is fair use. We've continued to offer it, and we have recently enabled it for some schools that are affected by Hurricane Helene. We're going to be continuing to improve the service for unfortunate situations in the future where it's needed. Now, in spite of all that bad news, I also do want to remind you that there are well-established ways for libraries to share access to collections, including digitized collections. These are enshrined in the United States in the Copyright Act, Section 108, library exceptions, but they're enshrined in law in other countries in different ways. And these include things like document delivery and interlibrary loan. So you can go ahead to the next slide. And I want to just tell you that in 2024 and later this year in 2025, we'll be developing some preliminary service plans for implementation of resource sharing using Hathitrust. And what that means is we're looking for ways we can make the Hathitrust collection a source for fulfillment, right? And there are various ways we might do that. We have some theories about how it could work and ways we could do it quickly and ways that we could do it in the long run. And what I would tell you right now is that this fall, we're going to try to road test those theories with members. We're going to talk with resource sharing staff to try to understand how this service might fit into their own implementations and workflows. And then if all goes according to plan in the spring, we'll start developing a pilot. I don't have firm dates here. Ange Zaitsev is leading our investigation of resource sharing services based on the collection, and she does not want me to overpromise, so I will not do that today. You'll have an opportunity to, they will join us later in this meeting during panel discussion on the topic of new uses of the collection. I want to talk now about another aspect of our strategic vision, and that is about the enrichment of text and metadata. So first thing on the next slide, what you'll see is some statements about how we intend to do that. The vision statement here is that we will enable new forms of discovery. Sorry, I just have to take a note there. We'll enable new forms of discovery, access, and use of the Hathitrust collection through large-scale enhancement of text and metadata. And so access is critical, but findability and discovery is also critical. Users face real challenges to finding and using what one needs in the collection. We have to acknowledge that, right? Because the collection has source data that has been produced mass digitization in OCR. We have metadata from a variety of sources, various vintages. Search functionality is based largely on what we have in the data sources. So there's a lot that we could really need to figure out how to do to solve the problem of findability in large-scale collections like Hathitrust. I don't know that we'll ever solve it, but I do think there is a fundamental adjustment in the orientation to our collection and metadata that we are promising to make here. So historically, we've rarely directly intervened or submitted to the data that's been submitted to us, right? We have worked with submitting libraries to request changes or updates or corrections. What we're talking about here is the ability to potentially undertake larger scale assessments of quality, extending these records to improve discovery, completeness of bibliographic records, maybe then correcting or extending records to improve discovery. The point I want to make also is that we have to do this with our members and that we have to be mindful not to create metadata silos, right? It's no good if Hathitrust just creates this huge metadata silo and that does not benefit the rest of the community. So I want to commit to us, keeping in mind our role in the ecology, but I also want to acknowledge that this is perhaps the most ambitious and most challenging part of our strategic vision, specifically the statement about applying existing and emerging computational tools and methods in service of text and metadata improvement. The pace of change here and really the degree of hype in this space makes it really challenging to pin this down. And there is no single technology or computational method that we should expect to use in the coming years. So as we attempt to realize this part of our strategic vision, we're going to be working differently than we have in the past. So on the next slide, I have some more information to share with you. Some of you know that last week I shared important news about the Hathitrust Research Center, and that news is that at the end of 2026, Hathitrust will suspend its funding for the operations of the Research Center. So I'd like to take a minute and explain a little bit more about the reason for this decision and how it fits into our plans. Since 2011, the Research Center has really broken new ground, right? They have developed methods for secure text and data mining on copyrighted materials. They have created models for extracting and distributing more useful data from large collections like Hathitrust. They've done exceptional service in the digital humanities. Since 2011, the Research Center has always operated separately from the Hathitrust Digital Library operations. It's based at Indiana University and the University of Illinois. While we have worked together, and the Research Center has received funding from a variety of sources, including external granting agencies, but also in-kind support from their host institutions in Indiana and Illinois, and also significant financial support from Hathitrust. What I need to tell you is that despite the successes that they have had, really many of our members have rarely used the service, or their users have rarely used the service. And so while we're supporting the service and making use of member fees to support it, unfortunately, we don't believe that the payoff has really been there, right? Most of our members have not benefited in the ways we'd really intended. So through the strategic planning process, we recognize that not only that this was an issue, but we also were missing opportunities to integrate these tools and these methods into our workflows, our systems, and our services to improve the quality of what we do. So we've determined that really we believe the best way to address this is for us to bring more of these functionalities into the Hathitrust operations, use our budget to hire new staff to apply computational methods for access and discovery. And our budget next year includes funding for this. Our intention is to bring expertise in service planning in-house to create more production level services, to enhance collections, enhance text and metadata, and improve the services. I think we can build on the good work of the Research Center to integrate advanced analytics into our workflows. We're planning a 2-year transition period, working closely with our colleagues to ensure that it's a smooth one. So today, right now, and in the immediate future, there are no planned changes for services at the Research Center. There are no changes immediately on the horizon for the Hathitrust Digital Library. But we are working together to evaluate these services and products to decide how they should continue. What I will say is that we're going to be looking very closely at how the work they have done can enable further work and how heavily these services are used. What I expect is that at the end of 2 years, researchers should be able to continue using the collection for analysis, that the digital library will have, users of the digital library will have more access to basic analytic services, and we'll have integrated some of these analytic functions into our own workflows for stewardship, access, and discovery. And I have just a very simple, suggestion or idea or model for what this might look like, right? So for over the last several years, the Research Center has produced a product known as the extracted features. This is derived data. They've extracted data points about each page, all 6 and some billion pages in Hathitrust. And we've talked about how we could use the data from those extracted features to extend our own metadata model to include page-level metadata through the collection. So enhancements like that could help users find specific things in specific pages deep within books. They could perhaps find images more readily, or they could zero in on passages in different languages. Now, that is speculation. It's a simple example, but I wanted to illustrate a point, which is that we're not seeking simply to bolt on some existing applications to the digital library. What we're really trying to think about doing here is employing these methods to prompt changes in how we work, how we manage, and how we steward the collection to make it accessible. Last few points here. I know I'm running short on time. I just want to say something else, which is that I am not a believer in magical thinking, and I'm a pretty big skeptic. So I don't want to stand here and tell you that simply redirecting our budget and changing our organizational structure is going to eliminate challenges and constraints on this work. There's no such thing as an AI black box that we're going to pour all of our stuff into and get perfect and pristine records, right? The reality is that we'll have to use various methodologies and technologies to contribute to our ability to do this work, right? And these can include statistical analysis, data extraction, machine learning, natural language processing. It could also include some aspects of generative AI, but really right now we don't know, right? We have some work to do to plan this out. All of these tools vary in design and outcomes, and that work has to be grounded. Then the work that we do has to be grounded in a continually refreshed understanding of needs. So we need to be warily engaged with emerging technologies, right? There are good reasons to be skeptical and cautious right now, especially as you see the AI industry moving so fast and so relentlessly self-mythologizing itself. But we cannot also wall ourselves off from the influence of that activity or its impact. So we at Hathitrust, just like our entire community, have a responsibility to frame our engagements with these technologies through a lens of equity, through ethics, right? We need to think about what higher education and what libraries need, not what those industries need from us, right? And that's the way we intend to proceed. So last slide here, I just want to say thank you again for being a part of this meeting. Really, there is nothing else like Hathitrust. We're uniquely positioned, I believe, to try to solve many of these problems, but we can't do that in isolation. This is, again, a community resource, a collective resource that we've developed to serve the long-range interests of our members and researchers as well. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with this. There's a lot of accountability that falls on us to ensure that we do this work as entrusted. But I want to tell you that I am really excited to face these challenges with my colleagues, and we're all looking forward to working with you to address them going forward. So with that, I will pause and see if I've left any time for questions, because I hope so.
You have, Mike, and
Oh,
I
good.
welcome folks to put in the Q&A any questions that you have for Mike specifically. We will try to answer them here in 3 or 4 minutes.
I can't see you.
It's-
So I know.
Yeah, it looks like there are
Mhm.
no questions.
Okay,
So
let's run.
at this point, I think we can move along.
Okay, well, in that case, then I have the opportunity to introduce Katherine Skinner. Katherine is someone I've known for most of her library career. She's someone I've long admired and found her work to be inspiring. She's currently director of programs at Invest in Open Infrastructure. It's an open knowledge researcher activist. She is an open knowledge researcher and activist and we've seen her work on community building, developing organizational resilience, and systems thinking. I mean, really, her passion is for facilitating and cultivating communities. That's what led her to co-found and direct the Educopia Institute for such a long period of time. And now she's doing that work still with Invest in Open. So she's going to present her talk with us today. I believe the title, Katherine, is The Emperor and the Community.
That's right. Thank you so much, Mike. So it is such a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to hearing from you all at the end of this. I will leave some time for question and answer. So with that said, it starts with vanity and pride. That's where this talk is going to start. It's a really old story. In the story, an emperor dreams of being admired and adored by his subjects for wearing the very finest and most elaborate of robes. He hires a team of tailors who promise him that the robes they spin are going to be both exceptionally beautiful and invisible to all who lack wisdom or who are unfit to serve the emperor. The emperor believes that he will be able to separate the grain from the chaff based on what his subjects see. He pays the tailors handsomely to get started, and the charlatans, with invisibility as their ruse, pretend to create the majestic robes. It ends with embarrassment and loss. First, the emperor realizes that he can't see the robes, and in shame, he hides that from all around him. His advisors, likewise, are each horrified and then scared to realize that they can't see the cloth. Like the emperor, they feign admiration. They don't dare to confide in each other about what they don't see. And when the robes are finished and the tailors are paid, the emperor dons those new clothes and takes a walk around his kingdom to show off. And as he enters the cheering crowds, they, like the emperor and his advisors, are so busy hiding their own perceived deficits that they fail to point out the obvious. It takes the child's innocence to expose the plain truth. The emperor has no clothes.
Katherine, I'm sorry to interrupt. On that note, sorry to destroy your punchline, but I need to ask you to speak closer to your microphone. Some folks are having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, we will pull it forward. Sorry about that. All right, so we can move to the next slide, slide 4. So for the ruling class who had created and populated the spectacle of this parade, what a long, hard walk home it must have been. They had been unwilling to see through the illusion that the tailors artfully wove. They instead had complimented the cloth, they doubted themselves, and they went into their own silent silos rather than sharing any part of what they were observing with others. In so doing, they redoubled the power of the illusion. So they spread it so that it went almost across the whole of the kingdom. And all too often, we as humans maintain the illusions around us, not because any of us fully believe in those illusions, but because we think most other people do. And because it's easier, frankly, to go with power and trend than it is to question things, especially in complicated, multidimensional systems. And the result? Well, we can miss what otherwise, especially in hindsight, seems obvious. I think we have illusions about open infrastructure that we need to question and dispel. Those haven't been maliciously created. We don't have the weavers in the background, but they're still powerful frames that are distorting our vision and that keep us separated and siloed and unwilling to act collectively. Next slide. So what are some of the illusions that I think we're living too comfortably with? And I promise someday I'm going to name and talk about more of these illusions. For the sake of time today, I'm focusing in on just one, even though I will admit that even a couple of days ago, I was still trying to make this 20-minute slot cover 2 or 3 of them. But we're going to focus on the first one, that there is not enough money to fund open infrastructure. I do want to nod to some of these other ones, especially like if one is good, 5 is better. Or open means or should mean that it's free, right? Or nonprofits are all values aligned and commercial entities are all not. I think we have a lot of problematic assumptions and illusions that we cling to in our space. And I'm neither the first nor the only one questioning those illusions. But questioning them is really hard. And really questioning, let alone addressing any of these illusions, would require big changes. Changes in our partnerships, changes in our investments, our procurement processes, our services. They may also cause big consternation in our parent institutions, which we always have to be mindful of, and in our service base, which we always are mindful of. Such changes take collective action. And that's the kind of collective action that established Hathitrust in the first place. Collective action empowered you all, a diverse, large cadre of libraries of different types, different sizes, different sectors, different geographies, to band together to build and care for and maintain collections. So for me, I see Hathitrust as a space that is already resisting many and maybe even most of these illusions. I also see it as a mission-centered investment that libraries make together. Together, you all are co-investing in order to cultivate and steward core collections on a multinational scale. It's really amazing work. And I'll have a little bit more to say about both of those things at the end of the talk, and I'll also be very interested in hearing your perspectives. But let's look closer at that first illusion. So the illusion on slide 6 is there's not enough money to fund open infrastructure. Before I try to question that illusion, let me reassure any open infrastructure leaders in the room. I know full well that most of my friends and colleagues who are directing and working for open communities, open tools, open services, and others that are occupying that notably loose category of open infrastructures, especially in today's political and fiscal climate, barely have enough money to stay afloat. Right now, even most of the core infrastructures that the research community has come to rely on over the last 2 decades are financially insecure and in a perpetual state of firefighting. They have little to no runway, let alone operational reserves. And as a result, they're chasing money constantly. They're scraping together what they can from any available source, and they're hoping that the winds are going to change for the better eventually. And those who know just how dire this is also know that calling out examples is really risky business. So some of that risk comes from how we currently get our information through back rooms, back channels. Information's privileged, and even knowing and seeing problems in our open infrastructure's governance, their financial models, and their organizational models doesn't mean that we have the power to address them or the authority to speak out about them. Some of the risk also comes from the harm that calling out examples could do. So spotlighting a trouble spot in the infrastructure, if it's being treated as infrastructure, should hypothetically enable us to collectively act to fix those problems. So if you know that your collective water infrastructure, your pipes, are getting contaminated, or that the water in them is getting contaminated by the lead in those pipes, you're incentivized to fix that problem collectively. The city or the borough takes care of that problem once it comes to light. Right now, we don't have a city or a borough to lean on, though. We have a whole bunch of open tools that we might call open infrastructure and lean on like open infrastructure, but that we fund and we build as separate service pods. So unlike calling out troubled infrastructure, calling out a troubled open tool causes ripples. It can cause ripples of doubts in the client base of the open tool or the open service if it gets spotlit that way. And if there are other options for that open tool or that open service, other competitors, many of the clients are going to hedge their bets and they're going to move their institutional investment somewhere else that feels safer instead of doubling down and actually trying to help the infrastructure that they're working with. Our current system incentivizes our siloed open tools and services to just jockey and pretend and spend inordinate amounts of time and energy trying to attract funding just to stay afloat. The library community has spiraled around this problem for decades now. We've wanted to go open and we've wanted to shift from tools to infrastructure, but we haven't known how to actually do it. Next slide. So that brings us here to what we have. When we look at the sheer volume of open tools, open standards, and open services that we're building year over year, we know that there couldn't ever be enough money or time or attention to give to all of these things. So this slide includes a vast array of open tools and standards and protocols and services that we use to create, on the one hand, curate, disseminate, and then archive and preserve knowledge collections. The images are screenshots of some perhaps familiar resources that have tried to map the open landscape. And those include things like the 101 innovative tools, which I should note now has more than 600. Mike Roy and David Lewis's work on mapping the scholarly communication landscape. You'll see several registries and information hubs on the slide, including Copter and SCOMCAT and InfraFinder. You'll also see the table of contents from Ithaca Asinar's recent Common Scholarly Communication Infrastructure Landscape Review. This slide gives me heart palpitations, but it's not just because we've created all these things. It's that we're trying to sustain most of them, and not in collective ways, but as organizational and often technical silos. There's not adequate money, time, and attention to sustain everything. We're libraries. We know that problem. Every collection we've created over the years has required a steady selection process. So one of the things that I want to assert today is that we need to stop treating our open tools and assets as individual items. We need to use selection principles to bring them into cohesion. Next slide. So what if it's not that there's not enough money, but instead it's that the costs of competition and duplication and siloization and isolation are all too high? That's a problem we can get our arms around collectively. We need more encouragement of integration, of organizational consolidation, and of interoperability, not more funding that we direct towards solo enterprises. We already have some great examples of how to do this. Each builds on open environments that are arching towards infrastructure, and I'm going to name just a couple of them. One is Archive Space. It fused together two communities and two technologies, and it helped them move into a physical host environment that was trying to build up its technical capacities and its readiness. Was it easy or pretty? No. But was it necessary in order to create some critical mass behind one infrastructure and to take advantage of some common service needs that were held both organizationally and technically? Maybe. Muru is another that I'll point to. It bridges several key open infrastructures together without absorbing them into one monolith. It encourages some interoperability between Janeway and OJS and DSpace, and it adds some service layer options and some new hosting capabilities on top of them. Core is a third. Many of you are involved. It provides recommendations that aim to bring repository infrastructures into better alignment. And then I'll also point to some work underway that I know many of you are following, including Blue Core, and to work that I know all of you here are engaged in, which is Hathitrust itself. Without bogging down into a metaphor, I think of us as kind of living in this nascent cityscape. And some things have been built. There are codes and standards that have been partly established through trial and error and through some friendly co-opetition. But now we need to shift some of the funding from the drips and drabs that we're giving to individual projects towards some city planning work in a full-scale way that lets us shift from what I would argue right now are a whole lot of starving, often organizationally siloed infrastructures that are leaning on too few resources to a smaller number of core infrastructures, all operating within a deliberate system that's orchestrated enough that it incentivizes standards and intentional integration, but is also loose enough to make room for continued innovations within guidelines that make everything safer and easier for customers and users to navigate. Next slide. So a big part of my work these days as director of programs at IOI is working with our team to analyze and try to understand the funding landscape for open infrastructures in this field of knowledge collection and curation and dissemination and preservation. That funding landscape crosses over both sector and geographic boundaries. It includes all the commercial, nonprofit, government, and academic players that are funding some portion of our backbone infrastructures like repository systems, cloud environments, preservation processes, publishing platforms, and standards. And what I'd like to draw a little bit of attention to are two of the things that we've been studying that I want to bring into the conversation you all are having today about co-investment. Both of these tie back to collective action, which is a conscious strength that's demonstrated by Hathitrust, and one that I think we need to cultivate and spread elsewhere. The first of those things is what we can see about the way money flows through the field. And the second is what we know about what motivates our interests. So starting with the money flows, you see the first of two key 2024 IOI releases in the screenshot on the left of the slide. That's called InfraFinder, and it's a discovery tool and resource that we launched earlier this year to help decision makers, including you all, funders and libraries mainly, to navigate open options and make sound investment decisions. Our first release of InfraFinder contains some detailed information about 57 open infrastructures, and hopefully many of you have both seen and used it. We're working now towards our 2025 update, which is going to grow that number from 57 to around 150 infrastructures, so stay tuned. The second big 2024 release from my team is pictured on the right-hand side of the slide, and that's IOI's first State of Open Infrastructure report. Our team produced this by gathering and analyzing and contextualizing trends in open infrastructure funding and governance and adoption. And we scoped the report to build on the information that we've collected and shared about the 57 open infrastructures from InfraFinder. So as with InfraFinder in 2025, when we release our next State of Open Infrastructure report, it will feature information based on roughly 150 infrastructures. So we're hoping to slowly but surely grow and expand our view. Next slide. So what are we learning about money flows? One of the things we've learned is that the amount that's flowing is significant. One section of our State of Open Infrastructure report focuses directly on grant award data. So in collaboration with Cameron Nayland and Carl Huang at Curtin University in the Koki team, and then David Riordan from Enigma Technologies, we harvested available award data about 57 infrastructures from funder websites and from OpenAir. We assembled those, we cleaned them, we interrogated them, and we built a data set that represents almost $420 million in grants that have been given to these open infrastructures since the year 2000. Next slide. So for those who are wondering who's in this group of 57 infrastructures, they're listed in the background of this slide. And then in the middle of the slide, you'll see a graph from our State of Open Infrastructure report. It shows what percentage of their revenues are coming from 3 key funding sources. One of those is contributions, and that includes donations and grants. Service revenue includes things like charging fees and selling goods and services. And then other is revenues that are earned from other sources. Today, what I want to do is zoom in with you just a little bit on the contribution category. So that's the 45.6% that you see in dark blue on the right-hand side of the graph. Contributions, again, includes any money classified as donations from individuals or organizations. I want us to zoom in further, so it's going to be a piece of that 45.6% to see what we can discern about one piece of the contributions, which is our grant funding. Next slide. The funding that's represented on this chart and this graph make up a portion of that contribution category. So again, remember, we're only looking at the 57 open infrastructures in our scope. For those infrastructures, we've tracked money flowing from 23 grant makers, primarily foundations and government agencies. It has come through 514 awards to 36 open infrastructures since 2000, and the total is 416 million. Now, for those of you who have ever worked with it, it will come as no surprise, grants data is notoriously not standardized. It's also not easily available. We were searching for needles in haystacks. So we can safely assume that this is a subset of what's out there, even for this limited set of open infrastructures. And this begins to improve our view a little bit. It elevates us from our usual ground level to maybe a slightly higher perspective. 514 awards is a lot. First, it's a lot of projects for 36 operational infrastructures to handle. While some of the funding inevitably helped to found and ground some of those open infrastructures, most of those 516 awards did not. There are only 36 infrastructures. So instead, the award is funding work that often is building on those infrastructures. So we'll take an example. A leading open infrastructure, let's say a preprint provider, receives a multi-million-dollar award. So far, so good. That's a lot of money. Everyone cheers. But if that award is geared towards all new work on testing and implementing new features, new tooling, or new forms of interoperability or standard support, that assumes that something else is paying for the operational costs that are associated with running the preprint services that already exist. There's a gap. Or if that award's not for new features or tooling, but instead is for maybe research that's conducted on the preprint infrastructure, that also assumes something else is paying for the operational costs that are associated with running the services. And again, something else is also paying for any increased stress that the research might place on that system. So again, there's a gap. And I think that gap over time may be costing us and our open infrastructures more than we realize. Our grants to existing infrastructures often require, but don't actually fund the invisible labor that's happening within infrastructure staff and teams that support the research. The funder's not at fault, neither is the infrastructure. Both are ignoring that gap, though, in ways that endanger the open tool that both are trying to serve. Next slide. So the view on the next slide helps us to see some of the vulnerabilities that open infrastructures are experiencing, even when they seem to be landing major awards that we are assuming subsidize the cost of the infrastructure for those who are using it. So look at what the grant funds are providing and also what they're not providing. Open infrastructures report that their biggest support needs are for operations, followed by community. And these two things together amount to 66% of the support needs that they report. This is where infrastructures report that they're feeling the pressure. But the grant funds that they receive, so over on the left-hand side, and that they apply for, primarily cover research and development. So I think it's time to tell a different story. We're funding right now for short-term success, not for maintenance, not for growth, not for interoperability. And it's not the lack of funding, but it's that short-term view that's making it so difficult for us to shift from a bunch of tools, each incentivized to innovate and build separately, to a collectively funded open infrastructure environment that we all agree to build upon. Next slide. So how do we begin to direct our dollars and our time and our effort in a different way? So I love a piece from a couple of Hathitrust, well, a couple of pieces from Hathitrust staff and members with the Through the Looking Glass series that was published earlier this year. And what I'll point to here is just that, you know, I think that this phrase is right on, or this framing is right on. We need diversity of actors and experience. We need more than networks alone. We have got to be able to have a kind of co-evolving set of shifting relationships. And we have to have different ways to bring different types of partners into those relationships. And if we can do that and create some of the links and the data and the service and the research source flows, then we could call what we're doing an ecosystem, which we often use that terminology already, but we could really call it an ecosystem approach. And that kind of approach enables some collective action. So I would say most of us have already decided that we should be pooling what we have, focusing on our areas of strength and some of the clearer signals of user demand. Most of us are also grappling with how to design our environment to operate more like an ecosystem. But we have models for that, including Hathitrust. It's funded by those who use it and those who care about the collections it represents. It's not heavily dependent on grants, even for its research and development work. It's governed by its stakeholders, and it makes room for diverse voices through a range of engagement pathways and mechanisms. It's becoming infrastructure in ways that are both human and technical, and that's powerful. It provides a level of stability that most open infrastructures and open programs only dream about. So what if Hadi wasn't the exception, but became more the rule, and instead of funding everything a little bit, we funded a common core well? Next slide. What could we use to select the elements of a common core? And how do we decide which of the many competing groups is worth investing in? That's been one of the hardest elements to grapple with. Who gets to make that call? How do we make sure that it's really a collective decision? And also that it's a wise decision that steers in mission-aligned directions for the stakeholders involved. And I don't have the answer, but I'm going to point to some of the very important work that's going on as I close this talk that might help us to find the answers. And those are going to be answers. It's going to be multiple, not singular. So I'm going to reflect back to two assertions that I've made during this talk. One is that our current system is incentivizing our siloed open tools and services to jockey and pretend and spend inordinate amounts of time and energy trying to attract funding to stay afloat. And while that may sound hyperbolic, y'all, I've talked to too many of the directors. They are struggling. They are spending inordinate amounts of time on the phone, chasing after funds, writing applications, doing the things that they need to just to survive right now. The second is that we currently get too much of our information through back rooms and back channels. Information's privileged, and even knowing and seeing problems in our open infrastructure's governance or financial models and organizational models doesn't mean that we've got any power to address them or any authority to speak out about them. Next slide. And that brings us to the end of this talk and where I want to transition, at least for a moment, with you. Hopefully I didn't leave enough time. But there's been a steady swell of activity in the last few years to try to give us some better ways to gain information about all the open tools and elements with whom we consider working or in whom we're considering investing. Increasing adoption of and investment in open infrastructure depends in large part on making it feel safer. We want to know that what we're investing in isn't vaporware, isn't smoke, isn't mirrors. And one of the ways that we're increasingly working to do this is through invoking our values and principles. So you see a whole bunch of different examples on the slide, from Humetrix HSS to POSI and Forest and publication facts and the publication scoring system. We're trying across the field, or developing ecosystem, if you will, to begin making open infrastructure options more visible and easier to understand and differentiate between. So bringing that back to the metaphor that I used at the beginning, the magic cloth that the emperor bought, and he bought it hook, line, and sinker, hoping to separate the grain from the chaff and identify who was wise, who deserved to serve him. Unlike that magic cloth, we can actually build transparent and not invisible mechanisms that we collectively define and use to evaluate, to study, and to better understand the set of open tools and services with whom we work. That can help to guide the investment decisions that we make towards more collective decisions. So mindful of time, I'd like to move us back to a full session and just thank you so much for your attention. And I look forward to hearing from folks, whether it's during the little bit of time that we'll have for Q&A right now, or feel free to contact me absolutely anytime. If you go to the last slide, my email address is on there, and I welcome observations, thoughts, etc.
Thank you, Katherine. We have time for about one question. So if anybody's got something big and juicy for Katherine, I invite you to drop it into the Q&A. And if not, you will be able to go back and watch this recording and then completely fill her inbox with all the questions. Here is one.
No, it's a sweet thank you.
Yeah.
A reminder of friends in the midst.
There is one question here. So how to avoid fears of monopoly?
Yeah. So some of it is transparency. I mean, I really do. The concept of the invisible cloth has been something, some of the people around me know that I've been working towards that talk for like 6-7 years. Ever since I finished the Red Queen's Race many years ago, that I published as a blog. And it's just so striking to me how that illusion piece is so easily dispelled if you just are transparent and if you're talking to each other. So the monopoly piece, or the unfair, conversations between each other, et cetera, as long as things are out in the open, and as long as we're not betraying non-disclosure agreements and things of that nature, we can share a whole lot about how we're formed, how we work, what our expectations of each other are, et cetera. And I think that is the clearest way that I can see for avoiding monopoly. It's not, we don't have a perfect ecosystem by any stretch, but I think there are ways to involve all the players, that if we're incentivizing better action through the types of value-driven and principles-driven evaluation that we are doing, it starts to bring that transparency that lets us avoid some of the things that we wouldn't want to buy into.
All right, we do have time for one more. What can we do to start identifying and learning from successful models?
Yeah, so this is on my long list of why haven't we? And we have. I mean, I can remember Nancy Marin doing a fabulous piece years ago on organizational models. There've been a whole lot of attempts to talk through some of the models that are out there, but part of the problem is it's hard for us to even see the differences between the models because we need to be educated up a level to even understand it. So one quick example of that is governance. We talk a lot in this field about community governance, community ownership, community-led. In reality, whoever's making the decisions is the governing body, period. And so there are ways that our language trips us up and ways that having clearer categories and clearer criteria could help us, not by creating punitive systems or anything along those lines, but by really representing, like, here's the spectrum of practice that's happening. And there are good models all across that spectrum, but you need to know which of those you're in to know what kind of power you have or don't have, and what kind of investment you're willing to make accordingly. And so some of that identification work, I think, really does come with the values and principles work that so many have been experimenting with over the last few years, and especially the assessment that could happen from that. And that's an assessment with a little a. It's not, big, scary audit kind of thing, but having a little bit more information about the groups that we work with, I think, will behoove us in all kinds of ways. Did I just close on the word behoove? I'm not sure I've ever said that word out loud. Thank y'all so much for having me, quite sincerely. And this is what I think about all the time. So anybody who actually wants to engage on this, please sincerely reach out to me.
Thank you, Katherine.
Alrighty, so now we have our break. So we are going to take a 10-minute break now, which will bring us back here about 1:14 p.m. for the second half of our program.
Okay. Well, it looks like a lot of us want to be together next year, which is wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. At least it's afternoon here where I am, which is New York City. I am thrilled to be here with you and to be emceeing these panel discussions where we have members in dialogue with Hathitrust staff. In these conversations, we're going to be talking about the collection and various aspects of its value for members and users. So right in keeping with the conversation to date. In particular, we're going to be looking at the scope and shape of the collection and how we can grow it more strategically. Then we're going to be discussing new uses of the collection, and then we'll finish with a conversation about its value for one member library. And I will be introducing panelists as we go. So let's get started. Our first panel is a conversation with Rice Majors and Heather Welton, in which we will be discussing the topic Understanding Gaps in Growing the Digital Collection. Rice is the Associate University Librarian for Scholarly Resources at the University of California, Davis, and he's also the chair of the Hathitrust Program Steering Committee. Heather Welton is currently the Hathitrust Content and Data Management Lead and Shared Print Program Officer. But the exciting news that you might have noticed in a previous slide, but that I get to tell you about today, is that Heather has just been appointed Hathitrust Collection Strategist and will be starting in her new role at Hathitrust on November 4th. So congratulations, Heather. I am thrilled that you'll be starting in this position in November. We take our panel topic, Understanding Gaps and Growing the Digital Collection, directly from our strategic vision, direction number 2, which says that we will expand the Hathitrust collection through various means. So today, Rice and Heather are going to talk about aspects of and possibilities for expanding the collection. And my first question to both of you, but first directed toward, I think, Heather, is in just a few words, what does expand the collection actually mean to you, Heather?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks from Rice and I for having us here today. I know we're both really excited to get into this. But I think from my perspective, we want to ensure that Hathitrust collection continues to meet our strategic vision in that it meets our commitment to the stewardship and preservation of our collection, but also ensuring that it's rich, broad, discoverable, and useful. We really want to aim to increase access in order to contribute to the research, scholarship, and common good by collaboratively collecting, organizing, and preserving and sharing the record of human knowledge, which we've already started. But while we do all of this, we do really want to expand and diversify the collection. And this includes considering both where and how we build our collection today, who is excluded from that because of the process. We really want to move forward and include a full spectrum of voices and perspectives.
So I'm actually going to jump in and pick up on what you just said about how the collection is built and actually direct the next question to Rice first. In preparing for this panel, we discussed some of the limitations in collection building because of the ways in which Hathitrust relies on contributing libraries for content. Our contributors are very important to us, but then that also limits our ability to shape the collection in some ways. So could you talk a little bit about this limitation and how our collection is currently built?
And I think I'm going to drop that to Rice first.
Great. Yeah, so I'll start a little bit. So most of the content in the Hathitrust Digital Library has come from mass digitization efforts, and in particular from the Google Books partnership, where a number of mostly academic libraries are having content scanned by Google and then contributed automatically to Hathitrust on their behalf. And this is over 95% of what's in the collection. Google is an extremely efficient operation in this regard and underwrites some of the costs associated with mass digitization, which has made it a very attractive partner for these efforts. The early years involved shelf clearing, literally taking all of the books off a shelf, scanning them all, and then returning them. As Google now largely seeks to avoid redundant scanning of the same title, Google provides participating libraries in the US with pick lists of materials that we own that they haven't yet scanned, and we thus send materials that aren't yet scanned by Google. Even though they're giving us a pick list, I want to say that these pick lists can have hundreds of thousands of titles to choose from, and participating libraries commit to a schedule of preparing and sending materials by the thousands, and generally speaking have tended to lean into operational efficiencies in doing so. So pulling lots of materials from the same floor of the library, for example, and perhaps not sending materials from branch libraries or other physical locations where the library may not control the loading dock for the relevant building, which would introduce some complexity. And when you're trying to send things en masse like this, the operational efficiency, I think, has won the day heretofore. And Heather, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think what I would add is, as Rice noted, right, the collection is built on and today heavily curated by mass digitization efforts and collections held in our members' libraries. And so really the collections frequently lack the representation of various perspectives, cultures, genders, ethnicities, and viewpoints. And it actually, mass digitization actually might digitize things that we would focus on today to digitize, right? There's certain things picked, as Rice said, that we don't have a way to pick ourselves of what we would do. And so the way we currently are limited in building our collection can hinder our ability to meet these visions. But the good news I will share with you all is that Hathitrust does have some recent projects and priorities along with our strategic vision to help change some of this. And so as Jennifer mentioned, I'm stepping into the new role, which will help us strategize and support the development of new collection uses and growth. We also just started a project on improving our ingest process with the goal of making the process of ingesting content in a Hathitrust easier for both members and non-members. We, as Mike talked about earlier, we really want to expand access to and increase use of copyrighted, open, and public domain works. And right now, this is largely done by our copyright review program, which is wonderful, but we're also working on ways to automate it and scale this types of work. And we're really working towards enabling members to identify, digitize, preserve, and contribute their own unique content to our collection, especially those from underrepresented and historically marginalized voices. And then we do want to work forward and engage with more organizations and scholarly publishers already digitizing content to collaborate on preserving this important content. And finally, again, as Mike mentioned this morning, we are investing heavily in our core and enabling infrastructure to support the curating and diversifying of our collections.
So I wanted to hear a little bit. I know that Rice is has been thinking about what libraries can be doing, and to help us think a little bit differently about how we build out the collection. So Rice, why don't you tell us about maybe about some of your work and about what some libraries are already doing in this space.
Yeah, so coming out of the pandemic and talking to some of the faculty on my campus, it really became clear that what we send sooner rather than later to be scanned and included in the library, the digital library, really matters. And I've been putting a lot of thought into that in the last few years. I'm pleased to say that some of the Google Books partnership libraries have recently begun to look at whether we could coordinate some of what we send, so that rather than sending things in call number order or only sending materials from our most straightforward locations, we are instead starting from a desire to send certain kinds of content and potentially coordinate. So, and again, with this idea that it matters the order in which we send things, because there's millions and millions of things potentially to eventually include. So we have an active pilot at the moment where 4 libraries who work in the Google Books partnership are sending materials on 2 topics, pollinators and Puerto Rico, as a proof of concept of what this coordination might look like. And assuming we have even modest success in this pilot, it holds great promise for libraries to start to prioritize what content gets scanned and made available. And I think, kind of building on some of what Heather has said, heretofore, Hathitrust hasn't really been steering what content comes in. The libraries haven't been steering what content comes in. And to a certain extent, Google is not steering what content gets in. There's just a lot of content coming in. And so we're trying to increase the amount of thought that is put behind that. If I can, there's another opportunity that UC Davis has pushed on a couple of times now, and I know that some other libraries have as well, which is to work directly with copyright owners to try to get some of their content more available by getting some content available through a Creative Commons license. So UC Davis has successfully worked with one publisher, and we're in negotiations with a second one to get the entire run of a journal, their entire back catalog, made available, so that the content can be digitized if it isn't already digitized and contributed, and then can sunrise immediately for full access through the Hathitrust Digital Library. And that starts to open up content in a way that increases equity of access, because it's just available to everybody, regardless of whether your library has an active subscription, et cetera, et cetera. So that's been a really rewarding outcome.
So, Heather, as incoming collection strategist, I know you're not in the job yet, but you have been thinking about the collection for a really long time. And I'm wondering if you can share with us some thoughts about what on our end, what we can be doing in addition to some of the things that Rice has been talking about. Like what do you see as some future activities?
Yeah, so I think a couple of the things I mentioned earlier, along with what Rice just mentioned, are great first steps, right? So ingest will allow us to improve who can contribute, members or non-members, and eventually even things like EPUBs or PDFs, which we haven't been able to support thus far in our infrastructure. I also think collaborating with other stakeholders in digitization efforts with an eye towards securing these unique items and diverse voices will help start us in this effort. I really would argue, though, that the biggest next step and the biggest impact Hathitrust can really have in this area is around community building and community-informed work. And I would encourage us to start asking ourselves what the capabilities are of Hathitrust and where do we need to partner to do this work. You know, we're talking about obviously our community, so we are talking about members, but we're also talking more expansive than that when we say community, right? We're including non-members, publishers, vendors, and potentially others. We really want to start by focusing on fostering community building and creating inclusive spaces and these meaningful interactions. And we really want to work towards enhancing our community insight through more regular feedback, shared experiences, and open dialogue around this work. So we can work with the community to identify needs, strengths, and opportunities for Hathitrust to grow and how we can help them.
So we have, looks like just about, 3 more minutes, 2.5 minutes. So I'm going to ask you a final question. Rice came to us, maybe it was over the summer, asking if we could explain what some of the strengths and gaps in the collection were. And we kind of struggled to do that. I recognize that in order for us to know how we might want to expand the collection, we have to understand the shape of it. So I'm wondering, I'll pass this to Heather, and then maybe Rice, you could, wrap up if you want. Heather, could you just say a little bit about what kind of questions we need to be able to answer about the collection in order to think about expanding it strategically?
Yeah, great. Great question. I think I would start by saying collection management and assessment. I think it was McClure who said this is an art, not a science. It's kind of impossible to understand everything that's in your collection. But I do think Hathitrust needs to start with analyzing and interrogating our collections and working with our members to talk more about that. I think we should ask pretty basic questions, right? Including some of the data Melissa shared ahead of the member meeting. Where are we strongest? What call number ranges do we have? Where are items published and by whom? But then we should start asking things like what's missing? Where are their gaps? Where are their voices limited? And I would encourage us to, again, focus on community-informed work to come up with these questions and to think about these questions to understand not just quantitative data, but qualitative data too.
And in our last 45 seconds, I wonder if Rice, you want to throw anything else out there?
Sure. I think there's also, we could look at different kind of user profiles and how they are or are not being served by the collection and use that as a kind of a data point as well. So I'm thinking of things like the reading, people who have a reading disability, and what do they look for from the Hathitrust collection that they can't find? Is there some, finite number of things where if we could only scan those things, those users would be much better served in terms of trying to complete an undergraduate curriculum? Or, digital humanists, what have they tried to do through the Hathitrust Research Center, which I know is going to evolve like a Pokemon, but what have they tried to do so far in terms of projects that Hathitrust really kind of had to say no to because you don't have the collections to be able to stand behind the project that wants to move forward? And are there things that libraries could be doing to, but right now I feel like when we chose pollinators in Puerto Rico, those as our pilot topics, those were in some ways, kind of gut instinct decisions rather than data informed decisions. We know that users want this material to be in there. So it's a proof of concept, and hopefully we'll make more data informed decisions going forward.
And you have perfectly teed up our second panelists. So I want to thank you for that. We ended on the topic of users and needs. And the next panel is actually about new uses of the collection, which of course has to take into account the users of the collection. So our collection contains over 18 million items. That's a lot. Our membership continues to grow, and we have users from around the world. So we thought it would be interesting to have a panel discuss new uses of the collection. And our guests include Hannah Skates-Kettler, AUL for Academic Services at Iowa State University. And I want to note that Hannah was also a team member on the Mellon-funded Collections as Data project, the part to whole portion of that project. And I can actually drop a link in the chat. And we're going to be in conversation with Ange Zaitchev, who has already been mentioned earlier for their work on resource sharing. And Ange is the Hathitrust user research and digital services librarian. So I'm going to lob the first question to Hannah and ask, and acknowledge that you came to our attention in particular because of your involvement in the Collections as Data initiative. And I'm just wondering if you could give a really brief overview of that initiative and what it's trying to accomplish.
Yeah, happy to do that. I hope you can hear me okay. So a little bit about the initiative. As Jennifer mentioned, I participated in a segment of that overall series of grants. So the initiative or project itself really started around 2014, 2015 with a number of colleagues that I'm still very connected to, of course. And the whole point of that was to address at that time an emerging need to deliver collections in a different way, specifically one that was computationally amenable. So, for example, objects in our collections, our digital collections in particular, including metadata when we're talking about things that could be geolocated, so geotagging or adding latitude and longitude, or structuring our content as XML rather than simply images of a page of text using TEI, for example, and deploying it that way. Or 3D data and spatial temporal elements of environments and things that we're discussing and creating or have within our digital collections. But intrinsically, the initiative was really deeply rooted in the user community and the user community focus. For at least initially, librarians, archivists, researchers, et cetera, but really also then following through this thread through the multiple projects, investing in evaluating and addressing the problems of archival or historical archival and cultural heritage structures by leveraging the moment of mass digitization to really connect differently with our communities and do differently by them as well. But concretely then, the part that I was participating in, the goals were to develop a framework to engage with the movement of collections as data that had started in and around the 2014 timeline, and allow any memory knowledge organizations or workers to engage in that and employ baseline expectations around what that looks like to engage. That was defined within a diverse set of an internationally based community for that practice. So in addition to the final report and things that you can find on that page, one thing you might notice is the Vancouver statement that is worth taking a look at as well.
So I would like to follow up with you. In the last panel, we're talking about growing the collection, expanding the collection. And so new or expanded collections are inevitably going to open up the possibility for new use cases, new users, new needs. So how do you think about user engagement with a collection such as Hathitrust or any other, kind of large data set? But how do you think about user engagement with a collection that is changing, and how does user engagement change as the collection grows, and how do we think about that?
Yeah, I think initially we talked about this more so like we're moving to the digital. We're going to have new people engaging with our collections, and it's a similar kind of iterative conversation that we have as things are digital. So as we allow for or present different modes of engaging with our collections, we inevitably encounter new users by nature of connecting with folks where they are. So with those different users, then comes a different set of expectations, right, that we're then we have the potential to respond to, I suppose. So expanding the use of our digital collections is a response that we can expect to continue as our digital collections proliferate in this digital sphere and out in the world. So one of the things one of the strategies, of course, that I think folks have and will potentially touch on is listening. And listening to the users and expectations that they have, because different users bring with them different expectations. And that was something that the Collections as Data project was also responding to, was this kind of, we're hearing that there are things that folks want to do with our collections and can't. And so folks are expecting to do something differently with our collections. And it's an opportunity for us then to respond to those different needs and the different user base that we are engaging with as our collections grow, as they touch on different components of our culture, et cetera. And then one of the things that I think is a shift a little bit is that recentering of that community dialogue, not just in the listening capacity, but also in like the opportunity to bring them into the creation of those collections, either as data or otherwise, and involve them also then into conversations about how ultimately the end user is considered and how we expect or would like folks to engage with those collections. And so it also brings into question then those different users. Are we talking about folks who are required, different languages that we might need to address, or different use policies, et cetera? So I mean, there's a lot there. But that's what I'll say, is that active listening component really is part and parcel of the continued evolution and responsiveness of a collection of this size, of the communities that we're reaching with the different collections that we ultimately hope to cultivate and present in the digital.
So, Ange, Hannah's kind of teeing you up in a way by talking about active listening and engagement with users. So I'm wondering if if you could also address this question of a changing collection. I know that during your own user research and your participation in Project Lend, that you've learned about how users are accessing the collection. And I know you've been thinking about what that could mean for how we can build it and provide services at Hathitrust. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your experience engaging with users in these different ways and what you've been hearing about that.
Yeah, so before I reference some of what Hannah was talking about, I want to mention a little bit about how the Hathitrust Digital Library was built. And it was built from this idea that users are accessing one text at a time. So they're coming into the digital library, they're finding a book, they're opening it in our book reader application and just interacting with that one book. But what we've been learning in our user research, and as well as from the user research that has been done in Project Lend, is that that's a very simplistic model. And what we see, in fact, is that faculty and researchers, they're interacting with bodies of texts and thinking about how to change our services so that we are meeting those needs is going to be a really interesting challenge, because there's this gap between how the Hathitrust Digital Library was built for one text at a time access, and then like the services that the Hathitrust Research Center was built to meet, which is like a whole corpus of texts. But there's like this niche area that we have to think about. And of course, there's like problems like performance issues, But some of the other user research that we've been doing and has revealed a growing edge of use cases that I think would be really interesting to dive into. And it's not something that Hathitrust alone would be able to do to address. We've seen that users want to be able to easily translate books in text in languages that they don't read, or they want to be able to interact with audio versions of texts. And both of those use cases are things that are restricted by copyright law, right? That you can't provide the audio performance rights for a text are one of the things that are protected by copyright. But when we look at like the huge backlog of materials in Hathitrust, the market isn't going to provide those translations or those audiobooks for all these like niche texts that only a few scholars in a specific area are accessing in Hathitrust. So there needs to be tools need to be developed that provide those kind of translations and audiobooks, audio versions, while respecting copyright law. So that's going to be the real challenge there, figuring out how to provide those resources in a way that is legally safe. And I think another thing is that we've been hearing also throughout this member meeting is that Hathitrust exists in a network of digital resources. For a long time, we've focused inwardly and looked only at our own interfaces, our own users, their needs. But we need to start thinking about like the network, the entire network of research platforms that exist out there. And this is something I think that we especially heard in the Project Lend research, that there are the users experience a lot of frustration, a lot of roadblocks when it comes to conducting research because their resources are spread across so many different platforms that have so many different interfaces, different ways of interacting with texts. Yeah, I think that's, I had a thought I was going to start with, and then I don't remember where I went. But I think that's,
I do have one follow-up for you. Are you thinking, you're the head of user research, you have a lot of responsibilities at Hathitrust. You're also head of user research, in addition to thinking a lot about the digital library. Does anything that we've been talking about today make you think, I don't know, differently about how user research is conducted in our context?
Yeah, so one of the major challenges, anyone who does user research knows that one of the biggest challenges is just recruiting users to participate in your research. And Hannah, you said something about we need to connect with the folks where they are. But if you're outside of a community, like how do you even find that community? And another thing that I'm very sensitive to is that when I reach out to our end users that I want to engage with, I represent Hathitrust, the organization. And there's so many perceptions and misperceptions out there about who we are. But I am sensitive to the fact that I am reaching out from like this position of authority, this position of power. So especially when I'm trying to engage with users from communities that are suspicious of institutions and organizations for very valid historical reasons, that impacts how I am perceived in those spaces. And user research, the way it was designed by the leaders in the field, it's a very transactional activity. We extract data from our users, and then it's a one-time interaction. Usually I sit down, do a usability test, do an interview, and that's the end of the interaction. Sometimes we send them home with a token of appreciation, a gift card, which just further solidifies that consumerist perception. But switching to a model of co-creation, that requires ongoing engagement. It's not a one-time interaction. It's a give and take rather than just constantly taking. And it's for communities that are skeptical of institutions, of organizations, that requires building trust. Trust doesn't just happen overnight. So building trust requires showing up consistently. It requires repeat engagement. It requires people to get evidence from you that you are trustworthy. So that would be a change in approach and investment in our work. User research is already a very time-intensive activity. So I'm personally daunted by the work that it would take to switch to this different model. But we at Hathitrust, we're a very experimental organization, and I'm looking forward to trying out this like co-creation approach in an upcoming project around resource sharing and trying out new research techniques there.
So we have about a minute or so left, and I want to ask Hannah the last question because it's come up a couple times today. And Ange was just talking about the question of trust. We all have our opinions about AI, and AI. There are different flavors of AI, obviously, but I'm wondering how AI may or may not challenge this landscape that we've been talking about, or change how you've been thinking about this work. That question's for
Oh
Hannah.
gosh.
Sorry.
Yeah, in some ways, I'll start with the things that it doesn't change, right? That might be a helpful linchpin for folks to really cling on to in this evolving AI landscape. But our audience remains human. I think we can all kind of coalesce around that idea, or many of us can. What we're seeing with AI is that there is an agent out there, unintentional or otherwise, that has hoovered up a lot of our information, right? That we gave with certain intentions and expectations, usually from a very positive and good place, I would say. And so while the audience hasn't changed, I think our awareness and culpability in that environment that now exists, right? With AI, we're part and parcel of the development and ongoing creation of AI that's really based on a lot of the things that we provide freely and continue to provide freely. So as far as like how it changes the landscape, or how I think about it, is like there's a certain level of responsibility now that I feel in an investment in how AI develops, right? Because like it or not, I've been participating in this system. And so one of the things that I have to, or we have to really think about is that while there is this, it's not bleak, like I gave all of this away and now I have no control whatsoever. There are elements that we can really latch onto right now, especially, which is there's a interest and curiosity around AI that we can leverage. There's also a level of caution as well. Like it's not necessarily a wholehearted, embracing of AI and its impact in everyday life. So there are two things that are working in our favor, I think, as cultural heritage institutions, which is leveraging that curiosity around what is AI, what's it doing for me in this information space, but then also that caution about what am I giving away, what is it taking, and then it goes back to the things that we do really, really well as information professionals, which is talking about critical thinking, digital literacy, and information literacy skills, and cultural heritage and context and things like that. Like that's us. That's stuff that we're really equipped to talk about, and people are interested, and because of this interaction with AI that we're finding. So it's a really good moment to kind of interrogate that.
I really appreciate your ending on the human and on the question of our own agency. So I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you're both spending time with me today. That's the time we had for this panel, and we're going to move on to our third panel. I'll reset my timer. And in this third panel, this is a conversation between me and Nancy Hampton, who is library director at Xavier University of Louisiana. During Hathitrust's work in 2023 to develop our new strategic vision, it became very clear to us that the value proposition of Hathitrust, so what Hathitrust can offer a library and its community, is really different for different members. So we thought it would be useful to talk to a library director of a small member institution to learn why membership is important for them and the value that Hathitrust can continue to provide to their campus community. So Nancy, welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to have this conversation with me. And I'm going to jump in by asking you if you could first tell us something about Xavier University of Louisiana. So like, how big is your institution? What kinds of students does it serve? How many faculty are there? What do they teach and study? Just a little bit of, give us a sense of what your university is like.
Sure. Xavier University of Louisiana is located in New Orleans. We were founded in 1925, which next year we'll celebrate our centennial. So we're happy 100 years. But we were founded to educate African American and Native American students. That was the original, the initial mission of the university. Today, we're made up of a little bit over, we have about 3,100 students. Over 600 of those students are pursuing graduate level degrees. The other students are undergraduates. 75% of Xavierites or Xavier students are African American, and the other students identify as Asian, Hispanic, white, and other, with other being of mixed race. And I bring all of this up just to say that all are welcome at Xavier. We have a diverse student body, but all are welcome. We have about 250 faculty members, and they study a wide span of subject areas. So everything from humanities and business to hard sciences like physics and biology. And we are an HBCU, but we are also Catholic. And our greatest, we are well known for educating African American students who are successfully accepted into medical school and complete medical school. So that's our, that's what we're famous for, I would say.
Thank you, Nancy. So as we were preparing for this discussion today, you told me that Xavier had thought a number of times over the past decade about joining Hathitrust, and that you were finally able to join once we put the tiered membership model in place in 2019. So can you just tell me a little bit about how scholars at Xavier have been using Hathitrust materials?
Sure. We really started thinking about Hathitrust in maybe 2014 or 2015. Librarians who came to Xavier would often speak of having used Hathitrust at an institution they'd worked at previously, how wonderful it was. But of course, we were not able to join until 2019 when the tiered model came into place. And we initially planned to join Hathitrust and also contribute to Hathitrust. We, in fact, bought a book scanner, and we were planning to share some of the pamphlets that we have. However, in March of 2020, we shut down for COVID-19. And when that happened, we really used Hathitrust when we worked from home to help faculty who were doing research, and of course to help students. And it saved us in many ways. There were general topics that our faculty were able to use our databases for, but some of the more esoteric subject areas we really relied on Hathitrust for. And I recall one art professor wanting information about the Watts Towers and the Watts uprisings, and we could not find any ebooks in our collection that could help us with his questions. And Hathitrust ultimately helped us to give he and his students some context about how the Watts Towers came about, and the artist who built the Watts Towers was somewhat unknown and self taught and just difficult to find, but Hathitrust had several resources that we were able to use to get information. So, but that happened throughout our time working at home in 2020, that we ended up using Hathitrust for really unique subject searches.
Yeah, I did that search after you mentioned to me the interest in the Watts uprising. And so I did that search. Of course, we have to use the word riots, even though uprising is a much more accurate description of what happened in the 60s. And there's so many government documents about the topic. It was really wonderful trove of material about the towers, about the neighborhood. So anyway, I just thought I would share that. In fact, I think we even have a collection in there, a link in the chat now. So Nancy, as a library director, what do you, when you think about your budget and investing in partnerships and services, right? So we just heard Katherine talk about like how we're investing our money. So obviously there's some kind of a evaluation that you're doing, right? So how do you think about Hathitrust's return on your investment versus other ways you might spend your money? I mean, we're grateful you're a member, but how does that reasoning work for you?
It works for us. It makes sense for us because we get the most value out of being involved with membership organizations. So other examples of that are we are members of the HBCU Library Alliance. We're members of our state consortia, which is called Lewis. We're also members of SCELC, which is the California statewide consortia. So with different memberships, we are able to provide our students with different information sources. And a lot of the STEM materials are provided for us through other consortia, but we depend on Hathitrust for the humanities, for the arts, even for information about musicians or music. We depend on Hathitrust to give us in-depth information about subjects within the humanities that we can skim the surface of those topics in other databases, but we can't get to the in-depth information in general databases. We're also, because of our location, because we're in New Orleans, there is a threat of natural disasters that comes in the fall when hurricane season is just prevalent and getting worse. So Hathitrust is something that we are aware of it because when we need to evacuate or leave the city, we know that we can continue to provide services to students and faculty because we have relationships and memberships in organizations like Hathitrust. So faculty that teach prepare themselves to teach online, and we prepare to provide library services online. And Hathitrust is a huge part of that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, so Hathitrust has a lot of different, we have a lot of different aspects to, what we're doing with our community. We provide access to as many items in our collection as possible. We have discovery, reading, other services. We also, we're a preservation organization. So when you invest in Hathitrust as a member, are you thinking about all of those things? Which of the aspects really resonate most with you as a library director?
There are services that we appreciate with Hathitrust and think about. The one that most comes to mind is your emergency access, because it provides access to all of Hathitrust's resources in the event of an emergency. And we have used that and plan to use it should we need it in the future. Lately, a lot of students have requested, I think this is common at all universities or different schools, but students have requested audio books or audio recordings of the articles that they need to read. And so I hope to use the reading service for students who have print disabilities so that they can get access to articles through Hathitrust and listen to the information as opposed to reading it. There's an ease of use as well when you can search one repository and find everything there. So it's convenient in that way.
So we have a couple minutes left. I wanted to ask you, Hathitrust is formed in 2008 as a partnership of research libraries, right? Because they were all managing their Google Books scanning. We've grown to now over 200 libraries, including some very small institutions like yours. So I was wondering, it's really two questions. What do you think small institutions want to know about Hathitrust? And then what would you like us at Hathitrust to know about small institutions?
I think that small institutions, first of all, appreciate the transparency of Hathitrust governance. I think that's what small universities want to see. Who is making decisions and how those decisions come about. I know that I also watched the process of Hathitrust creating a strategic plan, which was informative and inspiring, really. As a small institution, it's something that I could emulate on a smaller scale at our university. I think small universities want to know how or if they can contribute to Hathitrust. I think they want to know how they can get more access to the resources that Hathitrust has. That for reasons I understand, reasons Hathitrust cannot control, we just don't always get access to everything. But it's something that small institutions certainly think about. So I'm not sure how we could contribute to Hathitrust. I was listening to the panelists earlier discuss wanting to speak with users or get the opinions of users. Perhaps small institutions could contribute in terms of letting Hathitrust know what undergraduates are telling us or asking us for. That might be a way that we could be more involved.
Definitely. Thank you for those suggestions. I agree. And in fact, there's been some back channel conversation about some of the things you said. So, we're listening and we're hearing you. I want to thank you for spending time with me today. This was wonderful. In fact, I have even more questions for you that I don't have time for, but we're gonna leave it there for now. And I'm going to turn it to Jessica to see if we have any questions. I think we do have some questions. And the questions that we'll take now are for any of the panelists.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you to all of our panelists. I'm going to start back at the beginning. So anything that we don't answer live today that we don't have time for, we will be putting in a follow-up email. So really we will be getting to all of your answers the best that we are able to, or passing them on. Here's a question. This would be for Rice and Heather. Google definitely is the largest volume here at Illinois But here at Illinois, we also send via Internet Archive, where we have far more discretion over what we send. Claire would be interested to hear if the panelists could see a conversation among members of creating and presumably funding entirely new digitization capacity. That's not Hathitrust's role to do digitization, but it is uniquely positioned as a potential convener.
Yeah, I love this question. I don't have an immediate answer. If you are not just Claire, but if you are hearing me right now and your institution contributes to Hathitrust, contributes content or wants to in through some other workflow, and you want to coordinate, I'd be glad to fold you into that conversation. We have a kind of an ongoing conversation of the 4 libraries that have agreed to lean in on a couple of topics. And I think we're open to dialogue about other ways to participate in that, and other topic areas just generally. So I'll put I'll have Jessica put my email in the chat, and feel free to reach out if you're interested in participating in that conversation. I'm not Hathitrust convening that, but I'm someone who cares a lot about Hathitrust convening that conversation.
I'll just add that this is something that Hathitrust has talked a lot about over the years I've been here, in just the 5 years. And so it is definitely something I think now that we have our strategic vision helping guide us forward, and the importance of refocusing on our collection and the growth and diversification of that collection, I do think this is a conversation that we need to take up again. And so I would like to see it. So if you know me, you know it's probably going to happen sometime. So.
All right. Here's a related question. Is there a way, advice, or best practices on how libraries could curate, identify, digitize, and contribute needed titles on our own without Google? If we're digitizing books that are not currently in Hathitrust, then is there a way to contribute them? What type of files and metadata are needed? And is there documentation on this or a contact person?
Yes, you can contribute content now outside of mass digitization. So if you are interested in this, I would contact, maybe someone could drop it, Jessica, you could drop it in the chat. You should contact our user support and talk to us about this. We have lots of information. We can connect you with Natalie, who would help talk this through with you. As far as advice or best practices on curating, identifying, and those types of things, that is something I do have on my to-do list. And so I would like to bring a community together to talk about how we would do this and how we would identify items once we've actually analyzed our collections a little bit in Hathitrust.
And UC Davis is doing that. We're also contributing content not through Google, because it's stuff that we don't want to or can't send to Google.
Okay. There is, I think we can take a couple more questions here. Again, still for the first panel, if Hathitrust can help us all develop ways of interrogating our collections for what is missing, that would be really helpful, because we all need to do this. How might we do this together or share?
I do not have an answer for you, but this is an amazing idea. And so I took note of it. I copied exactly what you wrote and added it to my notes, because I think we're better together in figuring this out together. So I think it's a really great community type project that maybe we could take up and analyze our collections together differently. And I have to read all Hannah's documents now too.
Yeah, and I don't want to not mention, like, New York Public Library does contribute content as well. So there's at least one ginormous library that is not an academic library that has a very different mission, very different kind of collection. So that's not New York Public Library can't save us all, unfortunately. They would love to try. They do try, but yeah, it's a great question, and I look forward to Heather's eventual answer.
I do think this next question looks like it's for our second panel, but I invite anyone to answer. This will be our final question. It's actually two questions from a user's perspective. The quality of OCR in many texts on Hathitrust is often less than desirable, particularly with older books. Is there a plan to improve this quality, perhaps by utilizing AI technology? And could you elaborate on how the Hathitrust materials can be utilized for interlibrary loan and document delivery? I recall Mike touching on it briefly. So I'm not sure who wants to jump in on that one.
I will say there's no concrete plans right now for use of AI in Hathitrust, but I've been seeing some really exciting chatter about using AI to improve OCR, but even going a step further in the accessibility spaces, using AI to be able to detect images and describe images in cases where the image description isn't sufficient. So I think there could be some really powerful ways that we can improve the quality of the collection going forward. Figuring out how to do that in a way that is scalable and affordable for a collection of 18 million texts might be a little bit of a challenge. And before I answer the other question, Hannah, did you have anything to add to that? Because you're definitely more knowledgeable about AI than I am.
No, I think you hit on perhaps the most tangible or more concrete conversations around how AI can be leveraged to support that work. I think the things that will have to be investigated more in depth is the kinds of boundaries that are there or not there related to how the data we're feeding into this gets used for the models and things like that. And so there might have to be some really careful considerations of the usage agreement around that, that I think is going to be a real sticky one, because then who has the autonomy or the authority to really sign off on that use? I think that's going to be one of the sticking points on any of this. But those two examples are great ones, Ange.
And then the second question on how Hathitrust materials can be utilized for ILL and document delivery. The way we're exploring that is thinking about it as like members would be able to, so this is still very early planning, at least be able to download chapters and articles from Hathitrust of materials that they already hold in their print collection. And that's just like our first phase of exploration, because that's very well grounded in existing ILL and document delivery practices and norms. We're going to be having a lot of conversations with our legal counsel to determine what we can do and what the risks are. And we're also going to be talking to our member libraries to understand more about their needs and use cases, to make sure that we develop services that really work for our members. But that's early thoughts on that project.
Thank you all. We actually made it through our questions. So I think I'd turn it over to Mike.
Okay, here I am again. Thanks, everyone. First of all, I want to acknowledge we're coming to a close here, so I want every one of you to click your sad face emoji in unison. I've really enjoyed this meeting, especially the parts where I was listening and learning, and that's been the majority of it, thankfully for me. And I think this has been a fantastic panel, and I really appreciated Katherine's keynote address as well. I hope that you're leaving this energized, that we've demystified a few things and piqued your curiosity about a few others, and maybe prompted you to think about some issues slightly differently. There's something that we often say in my house after dinner. It goes something along the lines of, well, 2 hours to cook, 10 minutes to eat it. So I'm feeling something similar here, because like 6 months to plan and 2 hours to meet, right? So it feels like we've barely begun and now it's over. I want on the next slide just to acknowledge the planning team who pulled this together and who pulled all of our participants together. Jessica led this, but Jennifer and Melissa also made major contributions here. I really appreciate the work they did in pulling this program together for you. And I want to ask you to give them a round of virtual applause, or perhaps click your clap emoji simultaneously. And then, if we all do that enough, Tinkerbell will show up. Most of you don't get that illusion. The last thing I just wanted to do is also, again, thank our speakers, Katherine Skinner, Nancy Hampton, Hannah Skates-Cutler, Bryce Majors, Heather Welton, and Ann Zaitsev. I really appreciate each of them taking time today to spend with us, share their expertise, their wisdom, and their experience with us. So now it's your turn to share some of your wisdom with us. Earlier, we asked you whether you would want to attend an in-person meeting. The response rate was 65% in favor of that. That's higher than last year, but Melissa reminded me that's because we eliminated the maybe option. But that's feedback that we will be using to consider and plan next year's meeting. And I want to ask you to provide some more feedback for us. So please let me get your thoughts on the member meeting. We're sending out a survey as well as links to the video, some additional materials related to the presentations. As you can see here, we are working well within the bounds of the capitalist system here, so that you will have an opportunity, if you respond to the survey, to opt in and complete the survey and be entered in a drawing to receive one of 5 $25 gift cards. So this is very important for us, and hopefully it will be a remunerative, never can say that word, a money-making opportunity for you, although that's not what we're here for. I just want to say one final thank you, and that is to all of you for being with us and for supporting us and for everything, really. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day, and I encourage you to have a restful weekend as well. So take care.